When Burt Reynolds made Johnny Carson cry, the makeup artist noticed it first. It was sometime around 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours before taping, and Johnny Carson sat in his dressing room at NBC's Burbank studios, staring at nothing in particular. His face was already powdered, his hair combed into that familiar side part. But his eyes had that distant quality they sometimes got before a show, the look of a man preparing to become someone else. "You all right, Mr. Carson?" she asked, dabbing at his forehead with a tissue. He smiled. The smile that had disarmed presidents and charmed grandmothers across America for nearly 2 decades. "Never better," he said. She didn't believe him. Nobody who worked with Johnny Carson for any length of time believed that smile anymore. It was part of the uniform, like the suit and tie. You put it on when you walked into the building, and you didn't take it off until you were alone in your car, heading back to Malibu. That night's guest list was standard for a Tuesday in 1985. A young comedian trying to make a name for himself, an actress promoting a forgettable film, and Burt Reynolds. Burt was always good for ratings. He had that easy charm, that southwestern drawl that made even his worst stories sound like adventures. He and Johnny had a rhythm together, a comfortable back and forth that required almost no effort. Fred de Cordova, the show's longtime producer, poked his head into the dressing room. "Bert's here," he said. "He's in a strange mood." Johnny looked up from the note cards he'd been pretending to read. "Strange how?" Fred shrugged. "Quiet, not his usual self. Says he's got a story he wants to tell tonight. Wouldn't say what it's about." "He's an actor, Fred. Everything's a performance." "Maybe," Fred said, but he lingered in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to decide whether to say something else. Finally, he left. Johnny went back to his cards. On them were questions about Burt's new movie, the one that would probably be #1 at the box office by Sunday. Safe questions, easy answers, the kind of conversation that filled 11 minutes and 30 seconds without anyone having to think too hard. But something felt different tonight. Johnny couldn't name it. In 23 years of doing this show, he developed an instinct for when things were about to go sideways. It was like a static in the air, a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. The studio audience filed in at 5:30, buzzing with the particular energy of people who were about to see something live, something that couldn't be rewound or edited. They'd waited in line for hours, some of them. They'd traveled from Ohio and Texas and Florida to be here, in this room, to watch Johnny Carson do what Johnny Carson did better than anyone had ever done it. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the man they'd come to see had been learning how to disappear in plain sight since he was 8 years old. Backstage, Johnny stood in the wings, listening to Doc Severinsen and the NBC orchestra play the theme music. Ed McMahon was already at his station, warming up the crowd with jokes about his golf game. The routine was so ingrained, it happened without conscious thought. Wait for Ed's introduction, walk through the curtain, do the monologue, sit at the desk, bring out the guests, say goodnight. 23 years, more than 5,000 episodes. He'd done this so many times that his body knew the choreography better than his mind did. And now, Ed's voice boomed across the studio, "Here's Johnny." The curtain parted. The lights hit him like a wave. The applause was immediate and thunderous, the kind of sound that could lift you up or crush you, depending on the night. Johnny smiled, the real smile, the one that still came naturally after all these years, and began his monologue. The jokes landed. They always landed. He'd spent 3 hours that afternoon with his writers, honing each one until it was sharp enough to cut, but soft enough not to draw blood. Reagan's latest mishap, a scandal involving a televangelist, something about the Mets. The audience laughed in all the right places. Johnny could feel them in his hands, responsive and warm. But underneath the laughter, underneath the rhythm of setup and punchline, there was something else. A tightness in his chest that had been there since that afternoon. He ignored it. He'd gotten very good at ignoring things. The first 2 guests came and went without incident. The comedian was nervous but competent. The actress giggled too much, but told a decent story about working with a difficult director. Johnny guided them through their segments with the effortless grace of a man conducting an orchestra he'd been conducting for decades. Then Ed announced Burt Reynolds. Burt walked out in jeans and a leather jacket, looking like he'd just stepped off a movie set in Montana. The audience loved him immediately. Women screamed. Men applauded. He had that effect on people, that combination of masculinity and vulnerability that made him both aspirational and accessible. He sat down in the guest chair, the one that had held everyone from Bob Hope to Richard Nixon to a young comedian named Steve Martin. Johnny leaned back in his own chair, settling into the familiar rhythm of celebrity banter. "So," Johnny said, glancing at his cards, "you've got a new picture coming out." "I do," Burt said, but there was something in his voice, a hesitation. "But I don't want to talk about that tonight." Johnny blinked. In 2 decades of hosting, very few guests had ever declined to promote their projects. That was the unspoken contract. You came on the show, you told funny stories, you plugged your movie or book or album, everyone went home happy. "You don't," Johnny said, trying to keep his tone light. "No," Burt said. He shifted in his seat, suddenly looking less like a movie star and more like a man who'd made a difficult decision and was now stuck with it. "I want to tell you about something that happened when I was a kid." The audience was silent now. Even they could sense the shift, the sudden drop in temperature. Johnny set down his cards. "All right," he said quietly. Burt took a breath. "My dad," he said, "was a tough man. You know the type. Grew up during the Depression, fought in the war, didn't believe in showing emotion, didn't believe in much of anything soft." Johnny nodded. He knew the type. He'd grown up with the type. "When I was about 10, Burt continued, I was crazy about football, obsessed with it. All I wanted was to play quarterback, to be like Johnny Unitas or Bart Starr. My dad thought it was a waste of time. He wanted me working, contributing to the family. We didn't have much money back then." The story came out slowly, almost reluctantly, as if Burt were walking down a hallway he'd locked years ago. Johnny didn't interrupt. Something in his producer instincts told him this wasn't a story you rushed. "There was this one game," Burt said. "I was 12 by then, playing junior varsity. My dad had never come to a single game, never showed the slightest interest. But that day, I looked up from the field, and there he was, standing at the fence, watching." Burt's voice caught. Just for a second, just enough for Johnny to notice. "I threw 3 touchdown passes that game," Burt said. "Best game of my life. I kept looking over at my dad, waiting for him to smile, to give me some sign that he was proud. But his face didn't change. Not once. After the game, I ran over to him, still in my uniform, covered in grass stains and dirt. I said, 'Did you see me, Dad? Did you see?' The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. And he looked at me," Burt said, "and he said, 'I saw you showboating. I saw you making it about yourself instead of the team.' Then he walked away." Burt stopped talking. The silence stretched out, long and uncomfortable. The audience didn't know how to react. This wasn't the kind of story that ended with a punchline. This was something else entirely. Johnny sat very still in his chair. His hands were folded on the desk in front of him, but if you looked closely, and the camera did, you could see they were trembling slightly. "I never played football again after that season," Burt said finally. "I told everyone I hurt my knee. But the truth was, I just couldn't. Every time I picked up a ball, all I could see was his face. That look of disappointment. Johnny didn't say anything. He couldn't. Something was happening inside him that he didn't quite understand, a kind of slow-motion collapse that felt both terrifying and inevitable." Burt looked at him directly. "You ever have something like that? Something where you did everything right, but it still wasn't enough?" The question hung in the air between them. This was the moment when Johnny was supposed to make a joke, to deflect with that quick wit that had saved him from 1,000 uncomfortable situations. This was when he was supposed to protect himself. Instead, he said, "Yes." The word came out smaller than he'd intended, almost a whisper. "My father," Johnny said, and then stopped. The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Johnny Carson didn't talk about his father. He didn't talk about Nebraska. He didn't talk about anything that happened before the spotlight found him. "My father never saw me on this show," Johnny said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now, something breaking. "Not once. He died in 1983, and in all those years, all those episodes, he never watched, never called, never said." He stopped again. Burt didn't move. Nobody moved. I used to think, Johnny continued, that if I got successful enough, if I got famous enough, if enough people loved what I did, then maybe he'd see it. Maybe he'd call and say, "Good show, Johnny." Just that. Just those 3 words. Johnny's eyes were wet now. Not crying exactly, not yet, but wet in a way that couldn't be hidden by the studio lights or the careful makeup. The camera stayed on him, unflinching. "But he never did," Johnny said, "and now he never will." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the crew, the hardened professionals who'd seen everything in 2 decades of late-night television, were frozen. This was Johnny Carson, the man who'd interviewed everyone, who'd made everyone laugh, who'd never shown a crack in his armor, sitting on national television with tears in his eyes. Burt reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand on Johnny's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, almost paternal. "I'm sorry, Johnny," he said. Johnny nodded. He couldn't speak. If he spoke, everything would come apart. The audience didn't know what to do. A few people started to applaud, uncertain, as if trying to fill the silence with something familiar. But the applause died quickly, replaced by a collective held breath. This was the moment when Johnny Carson usually saved everyone. When he made the joke that released the tension, when he smiled that smile that told you everything was okay, that this was all part of the show. But he didn't do that. He couldn't. Instead, he took off his glasses, those iconic black-framed glasses, and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The gesture was so human, so unguarded, that it felt almost obscene to watch. "I'm sorry," Johnny said finally, to the audience, to Burt, to everyone. I wasn't expecting to." "It's okay," Burt said quietly. "It's okay to feel it." Johnny looked at him, and something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding that came from years of performing, years of pretending, years of building walls so high you forgot what it felt like to be on the other side of them. Ed McMahon, sitting at his station to Johnny's right, was crying too, openly. Ed, who'd been with Johnny since the beginning, who'd seen every version of him, was watching his friend come undone and couldn't do anything to stop it. Doc Severinsen, the bandleader who usually filled awkward silences with music, kept his trumpet down. This wasn't a moment for music. The commercial break came like mercy. The second the red light on the camera went dark, Johnny stood up and walked off the set. No one tried to stop him. Fred de Cordova watched him go, his clipboard hanging useless in his hand. In his dressing room, Johnny sat down heavily on the couch. His breathing was shallow, rapid. The walls felt too close. He'd spent 2 decades in this building, in this room, preparing to be the person everyone expected him to be. And now, in the space of 5 minutes, he'd shown them something he'd spent a lifetime hiding. There was a knock on the door. "Johnny?" It was Burt. "Come in." Burt entered, closing the door behind him. He sat down next to Johnny, not saying anything at first. They sat there together, 2 men in their 50s who'd built careers out of being charming and untouchable, now stripped of all their defenses. "I shouldn't have told that story," Burt said finally. "No," Johnny said. "You should have. I needed to hear it. I didn't know it would. Neither did I." They sat in silence for a while longer. Outside, they could hear Fred talking to the audience, explaining that they were experiencing technical difficulties, that the show would resume shortly. It was a lie everyone was grateful for. "You know what the worst part is?" Johnny said. "I've spent 23 years trying to make people laugh, trying to make them forget their problems for an hour, and I can't even do that for myself." "Maybe that's not your job," Burt said. "Maybe your job is just to be honest." Johnny laughed, but it came out broken. "I don't know how to do that. I don't think I ever did." "You just did," Burt said. "Out there. That was the most honest thing I've ever seen on television. It was also the most unprofessional. Maybe, but it was real." When Johnny walked back onto the set 10 minutes later, his eyes were still red, but his composure had returned, or at least the appearance of composure. The audience applauded when they saw him, not the usual thunderous applause, but something softer, more tentative. They'd seen something they weren't supposed to see, and now everyone was trying to figure out what to do with it. Johnny sat down at his desk. Burt was already back in the guest chair, waiting. "Well," Johnny said, trying for lightness and almost achieving it, "that was quite a commercial break." A few people laughed. grateful for permission to laugh again. "Are you okay?" Burt asked. The question was genuine, not part of the script, not part of the performance. Johnny considered it. "I don't know," he said. "Ask me tomorrow." They finished the interview talking about lighter things: Burt's ranch in Florida, Johnny's divorce lawyers, the strange satisfaction of working with difficult directors. The conversation flowed, but underneath it was the ghost of what had happened, the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. When Burt left the stage, Johnny did his usual end-of-show routine. He thanked the guests, thanked the audience, did his signature golf swing as the credits rolled. But everyone watching knew it was different now. The illusion had been broken, and there was no putting it back together. That night, driving back to his house in Malibu, Johnny kept the radio off. He usually listened to jazz or classical music, something to decompress after a show. But tonight he needed silence. He kept replaying the moment in his mind: Burt's story, his own response, the feeling of losing control in front of millions of people. Part of him was mortified, part of him was relieved. Both parts were exhausted. When he got home, he poured himself a scotch and stood on his deck, looking out at the ocean. The waves were invisible in the darkness, but he could hear them, constant and indifferent. His phone would be ringing tomorrow. Network executives wanting to know what happened. Reporters asking for quotes. His ex-wife probably calling to see if he was having a breakdown. Everyone would want an explanation, a narrative that made sense of what they'd witnessed. But Johnny didn't have an explanation. He only had the memory of sitting at that desk, feeling something crack open inside him that he'd kept sealed for 40 years. He thought about his father, Kit Carson, the man who'd never said he was proud, never said he loved him, never said much of anything except criticism wrapped in silence. His father had been dead for 2 years, and Johnny had barely cried at the funeral. He'd given a brief eulogy, shaken hands with relatives he barely knew, and gone back to work the following Monday. But tonight, on live television, in front of millions of strangers, he'd finally cried for him. The scotch burned going down. Johnny set the glass on the railing and stared out at the invisible ocean. Tomorrow, he'd go back to the studio. He'd do the monologue, interview the guests, make everyone laugh. The machine would keep running, because that's what machines did. But something had changed. He'd shown them a part of himself he'd spent a lifetime hiding, and the strange thing was, the world hadn't ended. Maybe Burt was right. Maybe honesty wasn't the enemy. Maybe the performance was. The next morning, Fred de Cordova called. "The numbers are in," he said. "Highest ratings we've had in 3 years." Johnny was sitting in his kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the trades. "People love a good train wreck," he said. "It wasn't a train wreck," Fred said. "It was television. Real television. The kind we used to make before everything became so polished." Johnny didn't respond. "You okay?" Fred asked. "Everyone keeps asking me that." "That's not an answer." Johnny set down his coffee cup. "I don't know what it was, Fred. I don't know if it was a mistake or a breakthrough or just exhaustion. All I know is I can't do it again." "You don't have to," Fred said, "but you also can't pretend it didn't happen." After he hung up, Johnny sat at his kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet. He'd lived alone for years now, through 2 divorces and countless affairs, and he'd convinced himself he preferred it. But this morning, the silence felt different, heavier. He thought about Burt's story, the father at the fence, watching but not seeing, the disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. He thought about his own father, standing in their living room in Norfolk, Nebraska, listening to reports about Johnny's success on some Hollywood radio show and saying nothing. Not pride, not jealousy, just silence. And he thought about himself, sitting at that desk, night after night, year after year, performing a version of happiness he didn't quite feel, making America laugh while dying a little inside. That night's show was scheduled normally. The guests arrived, the audience filed in, the cameras went live. But when Johnny walked through the curtain and the applause washed over him, something was different. He didn't smile right away. He stood there for a moment, just looking at them, the audience, the cameras, the crew, as if seeing them for the first time. Then slowly he smiled. It wasn't the automatic smile, the professional smile. It was something smaller and more genuine. "Thank you for being here," he said. And he meant it. The monologue went well. The jokes landed. But there was a quality to Johnny's delivery that was different, a kind of openness that hadn't been there before. He wasn't hiding behind the humor anymore. He was using it, but not as a shield. When the show ended and the credits rolled, Johnny didn't immediately disappear backstage like he usually did. He stayed at his desk for a moment, watching the audience file out, watching the crew start to break down the set. Ed McMahon came over and sat on the edge of the desk. "Hell of a couple of days," he said. "Yeah," Johnny said. "You know," Ed said, "I've been doing this with you for 23 years, and last night was the first time I ever saw you." Johnny looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I saw Johnny Carson. Not the host, not the performer. You." Johnny didn't know what to say to him. "It was terrifying," Ed said, "and it was beautiful." Weeks passed. The incident, because that's what people called it, the incident, became part of television lore. Clips of it circulated, though this was before the internet, before things could go viral in the way they would later. But people talked about it. Journalists wrote think pieces. Critics debated whether it was a genuine moment or a calculated piece of performance. Johnny never commented on it publicly. When reporters asked, he deflected with humor. When friends brought it up, he changed the subject. It was the most Johnny Carson thing he could have done. But privately, something had shifted. He started therapy, which was unusual for a man of his generation and disposition. He didn't tell anyone except his closest friend. The therapist, a woman in her 60s who had no interest in celebrity, asked him questions nobody had ever asked before. "Why do you think you cried?" she asked during one session. "Because Burt's story reminded me of my father," Johnny said. "No," she said. "That's the obvious answer. But there's something else. You've been reminded of your father 1,000 times over the years. Why did you cry that night?" Johnny thought about it. "Because I was tired," he said finally. "Tired of pretending it didn't hurt," she nodded. "And how does it feel now?" "I don't know," Johnny said. "If lighter, maybe. Or maybe just more honest." A few months later, Burt Reynolds came back on the show. The audience went wild when he walked out, remembering what had happened the last time. Johnny greeted him with a handshake and a smile, and they settled into their chairs like two old friends who'd been through something together. "So," Johnny said, "are you going to make me cry again?" The audience laughed. It was okay to laugh about it now. "No promises," Burt said, "but I'll try to behave." They talked about Burt's new movie, his recent marriage, his plans to direct. It was a normal interview, the kind they'd done dozens of times before. But at the end, just before the commercial break, Burt leaned forward. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "That night, do you regret it?" Johnny didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "I don't." "Good," Burt said. "Because I think it might have been the most important thing either of us ever did on television." The audience applauded, not quite understanding, but sensing the significance. "That's probably true," Johnny said quietly. "And that's either very sad or very beautiful. Maybe both," Burt said. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, 7 years after the night Burt Reynolds made him cry. His final episode was watched by 50 million people, and it was full of the kind of controlled emotion Johnny had spent a lifetime perfecting. He said goodbye with grace and humor, thanking his guests and his crew and his audience for 23 years of support. But people who'd been watching closely, people who remembered that night in 1985, could see something different in his face, a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. He'd spent decades building walls, and in one unguarded moment, he'd let them crumble, and somehow he'd survive. In his final monologue, he told the audience that he didn't want them to be sad. "This is a good thing. After 30 years in television, I think I've earned the right to be whoever I want to be." The audience applauded. Ed McMahon cried. The credits rolled, and Johnny Carson walked off the stage for the last time, not as the king of late night, not as America's favorite host, but as himself. Just himself. Years later, after Johnny had died, Burt Reynolds gave an interview about that night. He was asked if he'd planned to tell that story about his father, if he'd known what would happen. "No," Burt said. "It just came out. Sometimes you don't know what you're carrying around until someone gives you permission to set it down." "And you think you gave Johnny that permission?" "I don't know," Burt said. "Maybe we gave it to each other." The interviewer pressed. "Do you think it changed him?" Burt thought about it for a long time. "I think," he said finally, "it freed him. Just a little. Just enough. There's a moment in everyone's life when the armor cracks, when the performance becomes too heavy to maintain, when the cost of being who everyone expects you to be exceeds the cost of being who you actually are." For Johnny Carson, that moment came on a Tuesday night in 1985, when a friend told a story about a father who couldn't love the way his son needed to be loved. And in that story, Johnny saw himself, not the self he showed the world, but the self he'd been hiding since childhood. The boy from Nebraska who never got the approval he needed. The man who built an empire out of making others laugh while slowly dying inside. The cameras captured it all. The tears, the silence. The moment when one of the most controlled performers in television history lost control, and in losing it, found something he didn't know he was missing. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or look away. And in that uncertainty, in that uncomfortable space between comedy and tragedy, something true emerged, something human. Johnny Carson spent his entire career making sure no one saw him sweat. But that night, they saw him cry. And it was the most honest moment he ever had on television. It wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted. It couldn't be reproduced. It was just two men, sitting across from each other, talking about their fathers and their failures and the weight of being seen but not known. And for 3 minutes and 40 seconds, Johnny Carson stopped being Johnny Carson and became just John. A man who'd spent a lifetime performing, finally allowing himself to feed. The show went on. It always did. But something had changed. The mask had slipped, and everyone had seen what was underneath. And the strange thing, the beautiful, terrifying, impossible thing, was that the world didn't end. People still loved him. Maybe they loved him more. Because in that moment of complete vulnerability, Johnny Carson had given his audience something more valuable than laughter. He'd given them permission to be human too, to hurt, to remember, cry. The night ended the way all nights ended. The credits rolled, the lights went dark, the audience went home. But they carried something with them. The memory of seeing someone famous and untouchable and perfect, fall apart and put himself back together right in front of them. It was the kind of television that doesn't exist anymore, the kind that can't be manufactured or replicated, the kind that only happens when someone stops performing and starts being. And it all started with a story about a father at a fence, watching his son play football, unable to say the one thing the son needed to hear. Some wounds never heal. They just become part of who you are. Johnny Carson knew that. Burt Reynolds knew that. And on that night in 1985, they showed it to the world, not as weakness, as truth.